How-Sen, whom I know through um, our work together on the Toronto uh, Climate Action Network, the cities group. And of course, my notes have disappeared about How-Sen, but I'm going to tell you that How-Sen he works for Toronto Environmental Alliance now, climate policy and analyst, and he is very knowledgeable, having worked in a number of environmental organizations, including Indigenous Climate Action, where he was working on against the pipeline. And he's also knowledgeable about carbon pricing. And so, very knowledgeable person. We're very glad to have you here to speak about Toronto Environmental Alliance and TCAN, Toronto Climate Action Network, um, priorities for the upcoming climate plan. So, there's so much to deal with, but we need to kind of boil that down into what are the things that are most important for us to do. Uh, so, yes, you're a climate campaigner at T, and you're from Etobicoke, but you've also traveled around and worked all kinds of places and have degrees, um, advanced degrees so very knowledgeable. So I'm going to pass things over to you, please. How-Sen, go ahead. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me, everybody, and nice to see a lot of familiar faces and new faces as well. And thanks, Andrew, for that fantastic presentation and all the work that you're doing with the city. It is a lot of work, and definitely we're seeing advances with all the work that we're doing with the city. But this is a very, very difficult nut to crack, and we've got to do multiple things at once. And we all need to chip in as much as we can. So I'm the climate campaigner at T. T's been around for over 35 years in Toronto. There's over 60,000 supporters. We're supported mostly by individual donations. Here's just a rough outline of various things that we have worked on, either by ourselves or in coalition with other partners, almost always with on the ground supporters across the city of Toronto over the past 35 years. So, and a lot of folks here have been involved in a bunch of these over the past years as well. So Andrew's already gone over this, but this is basically the challenge here. We're trying to get to net zero by 2040. We are at a risk of not meeting our 2025 goals and potentially not meeting our 2030 goals as well. Um, and then this is the thing that we're trying to figure out as well is on a percentage scale on the left here, most of our emissions come from buildings, and then it's transportation at 35%, and then waste at 9%. And then on the right, there is a different way of cutting this same pie of sectoral greenhouse gas emissions, which is by fuel source and by what that fuel is being used for. And so that gives you a sense as to where we're at. You'll notice there on the right that the fossil and natural gas for buildings is still about 51% of all emissions in the city, followed by transportation, and then methane and CO2 and N2O from waste, and then also others as well. So you can see that there. So this is a really, really challenging thing. And I think a lot about like, how do I even organize all this information in my head? And I generally organize it into these 5 categories. We need to electrify every single building in the city. We need to make it much, much easier to live without a car. We need to turn our economy from a wasteful economy to a circular one. We need to decarbonize our electricity grid, and we need to protect ourselves from climate change that's already here. These are the 5 general categories, and so everything that I do with my work at T as a climate campaigner falls under one of these 5 categories. So to give you an example of the big things that we need. So as you're talking to your counselors, as you're thinking about your advocacy, there's a couple of things on the electrify every building piece that we need. Definitely we need buildings emissions performance standards bylaw. So just because TransformTO passes at council doesn't mean we actually have all the tools we need that are necessary to actually follow through and get those emissions reductions. And so even if we're able to get the TransformTO report next 5-year plan passed, we still need a buildings emissions performance standards bylaw to set emissions and energy standards for all existing building types. Well, for existing building types in the city, starting with the bigger ones, and then working our way down from there. We are expecting a bylaw in 2025, but we actually don't know where that's at right now. We don't know if there's a lot of support for that, if there's very little support. We don't know what staff are thinking. We don't know what councilors are thinking. We know this is something that we absolutely need, and we need to start with larger buildings first, and we need the buildings emissions performance standard to set a timeline. So it's not about, hey, we passed this bylaw in 2025, immediately buildings need to set their standards, but we do need to give them a step-by-step calendar dates for when they need to meet specific standards and over time over the next 15 years or so. The other thing we need to do is for new buildings, we have the Toronto Green Standard, and we're currently in version 4. Version 5 needs to be approved this year because the next version of version 5 is supposed to start in 2026. And so this has been going quite well for the city. This is one of our biggest success points on cutting emissions from new buildings. But this green standard is facing a lawsuit currently from ResCon, which is the residential construction. It's a coalition of residential construction folks, some of which actually work with the city and some of which actually sit on some members of which actually sit on various consultation boards with the city as well. So we think that's kind of weird that, a company like Tridel is sitting in on city meetings and stuff like that, while ResCon, which represents them, is also suing the city at the same time. And that's definitely something that should be talked about a little bit more. We also need to fund everything as well. So that requires two different types of things. We need actual patient capital, which is capital that doesn't require 2 to 3 year returns, but returns in like the 5 to 7 to 10 year range, potentially, or maybe a bit further than that. So we need patient capital financing for heat pumps and retrofits. The ideal scenario is no cost upfront. The ideal scenario is you sign something, they put it in, and then the payment actually comes from the payback of the system, the payback of energy over time. There actually are companies already doing this in the city for larger buildings like multi-unit condos. So there are companies that come in, go to condo boards and say, hey, for no money down, not only will I retrofit everything. All you need to do is pay the same amount that on energy that you've been paying all this time. We're going to make money off of the energy savings. And some of these companies actually make so much money on this energy savings that they give the condo board a little bit of money back. And so as an incentive for them to sign on. And so it is possible because we know that energy retrofits save money in operating costs, but the upfront capital costs can be significant. And so that's why we need to figure out how to financialize this, both with private as well as with public money, in order to make this widespread across the city. And of course, we need to make access to incentive programs easier. So we need expanded incentives for building decarbonization. And we also need to make access to these incentive programs easier to understand. Right now, if you are in a multi-unit residence or something like that, the website, for example, is not ideal in terms of understanding what it is. And there's a lot of options on the website. And if you go back into studies around behavioral economics, most behavioral economists will tell you that like past 3 options, every additional option decreases the number of people who engage in a program. And so people end up with choice paralysis and they just decide to go somewhere else and do something else instead. And so these are things that we need to consider for the building space. There's others as well. This is just kind of like some of these top line things. So as you're talking to counselors, consider talking about these. On the transportation front, we need to make it much, much easier to live without a car. Right now, about 25% of all of the surface area in Toronto is dedicated to streets, and almost all of that goes to cars. a quarter of all land area. To give you an idea of how much is parks, that's about 10% of all land area in the city. And so we need corridors where pedestrians and cyclists are first, not cars. There are almost no corridors in the city right now where pedestrians or cyclists have the priority in that lane. There are a couple of places here and there, like there's one out by TMU, for example, off of Yonge Street. There's things here and there, but we really need to follow places like New York City and Montreal and Paris and Amsterdam and start looking at like actual corridors that prioritize pedestrians and cyclists first. If you go to any European major city, there are massive pedestrian malls outside. That's the kind of thing that we need to start doing in Toronto here. And also on the transit front, we can also do the same thing for transit. We need dedicated lanes for surface transit routes. I went to Amsterdam about 3 years ago, and what surprised me wasn't all the bike lanes because I'd always heard about the bike lanes. What surprised me was there were streets where no other form of transportation besides streetcars and pedestrians were allowed. So cyclists had to dismount. So, and there are like these are major commercial streets in the downtown area. So it's not just about it's not just about pedestrians and cyclists. It's about like what is appropriate in what part of the city, right? And so we've been building the city as a cars first kind of city, and that every other mode of transportation is secondary. So we need to start rethinking one of our major assets here, which is all that land, 25% of the city's land space. And that's the main way we can get there. EVs and all that type of stuff, that stuff's fantastic. To actually get people walking and cycling and taking transit, we actually need to stop prioritizing cars on almost every street that exists in the city, which is where we're at right now. Other things that we can do to improve public transit is fare capping. So the Go Transit does this. A lot of municipalities do this in the GTHA, like other cities across the world do this as well. Basically, with the Presto card now, you can come in and say, all right, I'm going to pay one fare every single time, and then it gets capped at the 40th fare, for example, or 35th or 30th fare at that month. And anything beyond that, you don't have to pay anymore. This is particularly beneficial for those on lower income that may have cash flow issues at the beginning of the month. So what ends up happening is rather than paying your full monthly fare at the beginning of the month, you are paying bit by bit, individual fare by individual fare by individual fare until you hit that cap. And so there's lots of benefits from that. It also means that people don't find themselves in this weird bind of going like, should I buy the monthly pass or should I not buy the monthly pass? And it eliminates a choice point for them by just being available for them and makes it easier for them to just kind of walk on the TTC without thinking about whether or not they should spend money on a full monthly pass in on day one or not. And of course, we also need a commercial parking levy to pay for transit and other priorities. Commercial parking levies are widely used revenue tools in cities. I can name a whole bunch of them right now. Montreal is the one that we usually look at. The Montreal, the staff reports say that that can bring in about 150 million dollars a year if we were to have a commercial parking levy. But the Montreal commercial parking levy is close to 10 times higher than anything being proposed by staff right now. So then suddenly we get into the billion-dollar range potentially. If we're talking about a commercial parking levy that's of the same amount as Montreal, and that's because the amount of surface parking in Toronto is something like 30 square kilometers, which is basically like everything you imagine downtown between like the Don River and the Humber south of Bloor, that's about 30 square kilometers. So imagine paving all of that for parking. That's how much parking we have in the city. We need to turn our economy from a wasteful economy to a circular one. Um, Andrew brought this up as well because it is a challenge to actually do that carbon accounting, but we do need better accounting for climate impacts of waste. So our current carbon accounting practice doesn't account for significant scope through emissions, which are emissions from production or disposal, right? So like there is the consumption calculation that we have, the consumption carbon footprint that the city releases. But because that's so difficult to do, that's released relatively infrequently. And so there are challenges there, but one of the things that we do need to move forward on is improving circularity and localization of construction and food, because we know those are very significant scope 3 emissions that the city currently isn't accounting for under the under those two circles that we saw earlier. Um, Municipalities like Vancouver have recycling requirements for demolition waste, for example. So if you are tearing down a house that's built in the 1950s or before, you are required by law to retain 75% of the weight of that demolition and to recycle that back into something else, right? What's one of the benefits is, building built before 1950 in Vancouver is almost all wood. That's one of the reasons why they're able to do that. But these are the types of policies that we need to start looking at in Toronto as well. Is like if you're tearing something down by building category or by date of the building, X amount should be recycled as a rule. And then in Montreal also, if we're looking at food, Montreal has farms located on top of suburban big box stores. And so just kind of helping to close that loop and making more creating more food here in the city as well, even in urban spaces, that's all possible. And so we need to do that as well. And that kind of also goes back to all this gray space, all this concrete that we have in the city, either on top of roofs, but also in terms of what we have in the streets and stuff. It is one of our largest and biggest assets, and we do need to think about these as assets rather than as things for people to drive quickly over as they try to get to the highway. Other thing we need to do is decarbonize the electricity grid. So we need to eliminate fossil fuels from the electricity grid. The use of gas for generating electricity is increasing in Ontario, so we need the province to increase, to reverse the increase in gas generation and eliminate gas fully. And then we also need to make it much easier to capture and storage electricity on site. So solar panels, on-site battery storage, they face significant hurdles. So the city and Toronto Hydro can make it easier to store electricity on site. There are now building-sized batteries. And so that's one of the interesting things about the EV explosion of all these cars and stuff that exist out there is these batteries for cars actually are also can also be used and doubled up as once they're done being used for cars or even just straight out of the factory are perfect for powering buildings. And for emergencies, for example, say you're in a large high rise and the power goes out. When the power goes out, you do not get any elevator service and you do not get any water past the seventh floor. You need electricity to run both of those. And so having this type of scenario can also have a co-benefit if you're allowing making it easier to put in building batteries. You can actually draw from the grid when we're not using gas. So we can draw from the grid late at night when we're not burning gas to meet that demand, and then use that over the day to reduce the demand of that building and of the entire grid over the course of the day during peak hours. And then we also need to protect from climate change that's already here. So there's a lot of flooding and extreme heat. So we need to rethink how we pay for flood management. Right now, how we pay for flood infrastructure in the city is that it's built in your water bill. And you have no idea, looking at your water bill, that you are paying for flood management as well because it says water and sewage. What that means is if you own a large parking lot, but you do not have a water bill because you do not have a tap going to that water going into that parking lot property, you are not paying at all into the flood water that your parking lot is contributing to because you do not have a tap. And that is one of the things that we need to change in the city is to make it so that what you pay for in the flood water system is similar or matches the amount of non-porous surfaces that's actually adding more flood water that the city needs to spend money to mitigate and to make sure that it doesn't flood people's basements and homes and subway stations. We also need building standards and direct subsidies to help people facing indoor heat stress. And so, we all know things are getting hotter. It turns out a lot of scientific studies show that once indoor temperatures go above 26 degrees Celsius, a person's ability to even think properly drops significantly. And even healthy people that happens to. And so We've been pushing with the coalition to make sure that not only do we have a maximum heat bylaw in all buildings, but that we actually have direct subsidies to help those stay cool during heat waves. And then we also need to increase our tree canopy and our green space. Again, over 25% of Toronto is streets and just 10% is parks. That means that all that street and that concrete is absorbing heat by very significant amounts. When you have a pavement that is not covered by a tree, the additional temperature that pavement has, that pavement can be 15, 20 degrees Celsius hotter than if it was under a tree canopy. And rather than, and what a tree does with that energy is a tree turns that energy into the tree takes that solar energy and turns it into biomass, turns it into energy that the tree uses. When there is no tree or green space there, it's just absorbed by the dead pavement and then produces more heat that heats up our cities even hotter than they should be all by themselves already. So that's one of the reasons why we need more green spaces. And again, looking at the 25% of Toronto that is streets and looking at that as a resource as opposed to just things that people that one person like me and my individual EV uses to like drive as fast as I can to the Gardiner Expressway, looking at it through another lens and thinking of these streets as assets that we can actually make better for our communities in multiple ways. That's one way of doing it. Protecting existing trees and green space is important. And also we need to expand green space, especially in areas with low tree equity and a high amount of concrete. So, one thing to consider as well is when you are talking to your counselors, what about the stuff that's happening from the United States right now? There's a lot of stuff happening. So, what should we do during this time of uncertainty? And one of the things that Andrew was saying is that climate action is an actual solution to a lot of social problems that we have. And similarly, climate action is a solution to a lot of the problems that we are facing that's coming out of the White House right now. And so climate action supports communities and jobs, for example. So most green jobs are local jobs, building retrofits, local food, all that type of stuff. You can't, the building stays here, and so this job stays where the buildings are. And then also, when you support local climate action, the local money tends to stay in the local economy that supports other local jobs. And so that's why, like, actually spending money here and then investing here in green retrofits, in green infrastructure will have benefits, will have larger benefits here locally. And yeah, so you'll see that kind of like this aspect of local economies is very important. Environmental efficiencies mean more resilience against erratic supply chains. Over 70% of fossil gas in Toronto comes from the United States. So, and then it's also looking at in terms of waste and things like that. Like, what if we are throwing something away that can be used as a raw material for something else? That means we're far more susceptible to the ebbs and flows and the erratic changes that occur in the global supply chain. But if we were to take that waste and turn it into something else that we can use locally, that has a much stronger benefit and stays in the economy here and will feed more jobs in the economy rather than being thrown away in a garbage dump somewhere. And then one of the ways to look at renewable energy that I've been thinking about a lot is that there is no fuel. Renewable energy, the fuel is free. The sun will come down, the wind will blow. Oil and gas technology, that's not the case. You have to keep buying fuel every single time. You get the machine, and then you still have to buy fuel for the machine. With renewables, you just buy the machine, and the energy just comes. You just got to collect it. The other thing that we need to consider as well is we need to diversify away from the US, and that means meeting overseas standards. So the EU, UK are both starting what are known as carbon border adjustments. So they are starting to put additional fees on high carbon goods that don't meet European standards. That starts next year, and the UK is starting their process in 2027. And then EU, UK, Japan all have buildings emissions performance standards. In fact, the EU just basically made it so that every country in the UK, sorry, every country in the EU needs to set their own standard. And so, in order for us to be more competitive in these more diverse markets outside the United States, taking green action is important too. So we're all part of a global movement, and it's also important to remember that this global environmental movement was born during an era of geopolitical tension. It was born in the 1960s and 70s. It was a different era, but it was also an era of geopolitical tension. So this is being working during an era of geopolitical tension is not new to the environmental movement. And this may be the biggest social movement in human history. So I'm just going to leave it at that. If you have any questions, you can just, click on that, point your phone at the screen, join T's newsletter. We would really appreciate that. And yeah, thanks so much.
Thank you very much, How-Sen. Lots of information there, that's for sure. Um, I did invite people to put questions in the chat. We'll take questions for a few minutes. And there are a couple of questions about the province there. Can we get them to rescind some of their legislation? There's a reference to Enbridge, and Enbridge is, the kind of corruption or collusion that we know is going on at that level. And let me see. Yeah, that's a starting point. Do you want to go there? There's another question about multi-unit buildings, nonprofits and co-ops. Are they already reporting on emissions and standards? And does TAF still have their ESCO?
Sure. I don't know which question to start with. So, which would you like me to start with?
You want to say something about the province because people are aware that other levels of government are
Mhm.
critical to the success of our local plan. So maybe
Yeah, so the
comment on that.
province primarily on the carbon front. I mean, the province is responsible for a lot of things, including like a provincial building standard and stuff. And that's one of the challenges that the Toronto Green Standard is having because the residential building folks are basically their argument is we shouldn't have to follow both the provincial standard and municipal standards. This is ridiculous. But it's like, well, you've been doing this all this time, so what's going on? Why are you suddenly doing this? We've been having this in the system since 2010. So what's going on here? Um, on the energy front, the province has been adding significant amounts of gas into the electrical grid. That is a fact. However, when you think about when you decarbonize a building, and if you were to switch, say, a gas furnace into a heat pump and start using heat pumps and induction stoves and all that type of stuff instead of gas for all of that stuff, you are still saving carbon. Like you are still reducing the amount of emissions. And that's because in order for if I were to take out my gas furnace and replace it with a heat pump, the electrical grid would have to be something like 75% coal in order for the carbon emissions to be equivalent for that electrical. So like when people say electrify everything, they literally mean, especially here in Ontario, there's still a long ways to go. The province could still add a lot more gas. And if you electrify a building, you're still reducing the overall amount of GHGs going into the atmosphere because of how efficient these heat pumps actually are. They are, depending on the time of year, anywhere between 100 to 500% efficient, as opposed to a furnace, which is like 50% efficient, 40, 60, something along those lines. And so that's why it's important that we do both. So right now, the province is going through a process right now with the city, and the Ontario Clean Air Alliance is doing a lot of work on this, where they're setting the new electricity plan for the Toronto area. I believe it goes to 2036 or 2037 or something like that.
Okay, you're making me remember that Environmental Defense has an action letter that people can forward about the IRRP, I think
Yeah,
it is. Yeah,
that's
so
right.
so actually if anyone has that link, maybe that could be popped in the chat.
Mhm.
I'm not sure where I have that link right now, but yes, because it's complicated between the city and the IESO, and hydro is separate from the city. We do have an electricity and energy working group within the climate advisory group. So we're on to this. We're trying to do coordination and planning, but there's a couple of related questions to that maybe. So the question about who would manage rooftop gardens on big box stores. Are there organizations that run these?
Yeah, let me just say quickly that like assuming that you're talking to your city councilor,
Yeah.
talking about the stuff for the province is important, but it's key to understand that that doesn't really change what we need to do here in Toronto, which is greening our buildings, getting all our buildings off of gas, and then also producing and storing more electricity here in the city itself. And so those are two things that city councilors in the city has more control over. So it is like the provincial stuff is important, don't get me wrong. But the city and individual city councilors, unless they have a very strong personal or professional relationship with ministers, which some of them do, you can try to get them to lobby those cabinet ministers as much as the city can send letters to the province. But in the meantime, the key thing that's important to understand is regardless as to what the province does in terms of the electrical grid, what we need to do in Toronto is we need to electrify all of our buildings and we need to produce and store more sustainable electricity here in the city within the borders of the city.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
so that's important to know. In terms of the rooftop garden stuff, yeah, there is a company. Actually, a friend of mine used to work for one of them that does that. I don't remember their name. I think somebody posted something along those lines. I do not know whether or not there is a similar organization or a company here in Toronto or in Southern Ontario. But
Okay.
but those
That
types
might
of
be
things.
good follow-up if we do something more on food and food waste and food security. That would be good. Find out some more. But there's a question about multi-unit buildings, particularly nonprofits and co-ops. Are they already reporting on emissions and standards? Does TAF still have ESCO, ESCO? Do you know what that is? I don't know what that is.
I don't know what ESCO is. Right now, the reporting standard is buildings over 50,000 square feet need to report their energy and their emissions to the city. And then buildings that are 10,000 square feet or above will need to start reporting, I think, starting next year. The council just delayed that by about 6 months. I'd have to get that number, but the process is reporting first, and so that reporting bylaw has already been passed. Um, and then what needs to be passed this year is a compliance bylaw that sets actual specific greenhouse gas emissions and energy usage per square foot by building and giving them specific timelines to meet that
Or is that the emissions performance standards?
yes, that's the building's emissions performance standards for
Right.
existing buildings.
So that,
Lynn,
yes.
an ESCO is an energy savings company, and How-Sen actually talked about that a bit. So
Okay.
they come in and capitalize the work that needs to be done to save energy, and they take it back out of the savings.
Oh,
And
okay.
TAP used to have one.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think Jane is getting at how do we make this easy for buildings to do the renovations like the that are required to reduce emissions. And there are companies that make it easier if they can come in and help your building do that. It's a really good point about implementation, because a lot of this is about implementation.
Yeah.
It's also about where there's going to be resistance. It's one of the reasons why it's so important for us to have this group, that all of you that are here tonight willing to talk to your counselors, is because we know that the most effective things that we want to do are going to require others to change things that they're doing. They are going to push back. That is why green development standards are, being appealed in the courts. And the building's emission performance standards is the key, the most important thing that we can do about buildings. in this upcoming plan. And it's got to be mandatory if it's going to work. If it's going to work at the scale we need to reduce our emissions 20% by 2030, it's got to be mandatory, at least for the multi-unit buildings, the bigger buildings. And there's going to be pushback. So that is why we got to give the councillors the courage and community support to go ahead and make these things mandatory and not feel like that's going to cause them to lose the next election, because they're all thinking of the next election, which is a year away from the fall. And so that's why it's so important for constituents to talk to their councillors. So we're really grateful that you're all part of this. We have a lot of the questions.
And I just want to just like close off on the BPS point, on the building
Okay.
performance standard point. There are currently incentives for large buildings to do all the retrofits, and they're quite good incentives and all that type of stuff. But there is not a lot of but a lot of money is still sitting on the table. And one of the reasons why a lot of the money is still sitting on the table is because for most building managers and building owners, there is a risk to just doing the retrofits, even if the money is close to being free. And so a lot of building managers are unwilling to actually do that work, even though there's free money sitting on the table for them, which is another reason why we need emissions performance standards, basically, because we need a stick so that they will bite at that carrot. And there's been a lot of carrots out there, and they're not biting as much as they should be. And so, in order to ensure that that happens, we need building emissions performance standards. So, what Lynn just said right now is absolutely true. It is a vital, vital tool for us in order to move forward and cut building emissions, because it will create that stick to ensure that these building managers and building owners bite at these carrots that like just lying around for them to grab.
Yeah. And Vince has put some comments in the chat about why these big corporations aren't, happily making the changes that we want them to make, and having to do with the costs, who benefits, etc. So there's some good, useful comments there to think about the construction of how the city might enforce green building standards and the emissions performance standards. I've got comments about food sustainability and quite of interest there. And I'm actually thinking maybe we need to do a special session on food later, because there may be questions here, and people could certainly put comments in the chat if there are areas that you want us to explore a little bit more, because it's 20 after 9 now, and we said till 9:30 for tonight. We were hoping to do small groups or breakouts, but what we're going to do is wrap up a little bit by 9:30, and then if there are people who want to stay on for 10 or 15 minutes, we'll look at the next steps that we're going to take with our meetings with councillors and so forth. But we want to really give the opportunity to take advantage of the fact that How-Sen is here. And yes, there's some links on the rooftop greenhouses in there. How much influence does Toronto Hydro have in greening the grid? Do you want to say a word about that?
I'm not an expert in how the grid works and stuff. My understanding, and there may be people on this call who know about it more. My understanding is how they do the planning is Toronto Hydro and all the local municipal hydros. What they do is they go to Toronto OPG or whatever they're called now, like the prop IESO, I think it is, and say, hey, we think that we are going to need this amount of electricity. And then the ISO and the province figures out how to produce that electricity. And right now they're going with gas. That number that the city asks from the grid, if we were successful in producing and storing more electricity in the city, what would happen is that number that Toronto Hydro would be giving to the ISO and to the province would go down, because we would be producing more of that power locally and we would not need as much from the larger grid to come in. And so my understanding is there's the Toronto Hydro and Toronto Hydro grid, and then that's how it works. It's like air traffic control, where ISO and the province tries to air traffic control electricity throughout the province. And so but yeah, like That's the best I can say at this point. I like a lot of this stuff is very, very technical on the grid side. There's folks like Jack at OCA who will know more about how this works. But that's kind of like the that's one of the ways that Toronto Hydro can have an impact on the grid is by even just reducing the demand of power that Toronto Hydro needs in order to keep everything running in the city.
Okay, I'm going to point out a couple of things in the chat. First of all, I just reposted the environmental defense link, so please sign and send that letter that goes to the province, to the IESO about the renewable energy plan. Or okay, so look at the letter, send it, and we are working as fast as we can to work with Hydro to put more solar on the grid. And I actually found a link that SolarTO has a map. I wonder if anybody has that link to give people. You can put in your address and you can see whether you can add solar energy where you are into the grid. And where I live, my landlady could do that if she were interested. So I'm going to share the information with her, and she would make money over the next 25 years if she did so. So there's a lot of information about that. There's only certain parts of the city right now where you can add to the grid your solar energy because we have an old grid and not every part of the city is updated. So we actually need to invest in our grid. Yep, the SolarTO map is there. Thank you, Ray. And I also posted a link about a social media workshop on Wednesday night that ClimateFast is hosting with Tim Ellis. Election focused, but it will be how to use social media from 8 to 9 p.m. And the link is there if you want to register for that additional workshop. Okay, so it's 9:26. We're coming up to 9:30. And I don't really want to miss all the great questions that are on here. We can certainly add follow-up information in our next note out to folks, but I think we should at least spend a few minutes to just check in on what our next steps are about our meetings with the councillors. Many of you have been to previous meetings. We did an orientation meeting, then we did a meeting with Laura Lindbergh about how to have an effective and productive relationship with your counselor, how to go and prepare for that. And then we have this session tonight, and then we will be doing additional session on narrative, our own telling of our own story and building on our own story to reach other people effectively. And we are planning to do an additional orientation about the program in a couple of weeks' time because we're adding people to our group, which we're very excited about. We have at least 16 wards. We have people in 16 wards, but there's a number of wards that we don't have folks, or we have very few, maybe just one or two in our groups. So we're still inviting new people to join. And in particular, Eglinton Lawrence, York Southweston, York Centre, and Etobicoke North, Etobicoke Centre, and Etobicoke Lakeshore, as well as 5 of the Scarborough ridings can use more people. Scarborough Centre, Scarborough North, Scarborough Guildwood, Scarborough Agincourt, Scarborough Rouge Park. So if you have thoughts about people in any of these communities that you think would be interested in this, please connect them with the Wards Project. We have the Wards Project Gmail. You've been getting letters from Susan, and I want to take a minute to thank Susan enormously for her work. Susan Bakshi is the person behind the Wards Project at gmail.com and is really working hard to make this project come together, creating resources and making keeping communication going so we all connect with each other. Also, Val Endicott is in, and Judith Lawrence, also in our coordination group. And we're very grateful for all of you to answer the call to get involved, because really, we're going to make a difference to the future of this city. And our city is the biggest city in Canada, will make a difference to a future in Canada. And we're connected with the international network. So what we do is goes beyond our borders. It's extremely important to push forward in ways that the general public doesn't always understand, as in one of Andrew's slides, people are concerned about climate, but they don't know what to do. So we are kind of a link that helps move forward. What do we do? So I'm going to simply ask us all to express our appreciation to How-Sen. Andrew had to leave. We thanked him for coming, but How-Sen, thank you so much for being with us tonight. And I'm going to thank Ray for putting extra links in the chat. The next one is about circular economy that he's put in there. So please check the chat for links of interest. And do you want to make any last comment, How-Sen, for us tonight?
I think the main thing is talk to your counselors. This is how decisions are made. I can make sure that all these things are available for folks who want to take a look at it. Feel free to contact me. My email is in the presentation as well. But it really is individual conversations with decision makers that move the needle. And the coordination that I see here is really inspirational. It's very strategic what's happening here, which it's very, very smart strategy, I think. And so I really appreciate all the work that folks are doing here and all the work that every individual here is doing. And yeah, I just think about our linkages to everyone else on the planet who's working on this and people working at all levels of government, both here in Canada and elsewhere, even in the United States as well, even with all the stuff that's happening. There's a lot of great people doing some really great things. But yeah, it really is about talking to people, talking to decision makers, making strong arguments, backing those arguments with facts, and just doing that again and again and again and again and again until we get what we need to stop this crisis.
Yep. Thank you. Persistence pays is one of my favorite activist phrases.